There is a stillness to the Yosemite wilderness that feels like stepping into another world. No cars, no chatter, no deadlines. Just granite cliffs soaring into the sky, their faces etched with the passage of time. That is what I needed. An escape, a reset. I parked my car at the trailhead, threw on my pack, and tightened my boots. The air was crisp, biting at my cheeks in a way that made me feel alive. I checked my map, folded it back into my pocket, and started down the trail. The crunch of my boots against the granite dust, echoing faintly through the valley, a comforting sound against the overwhelming quiet. The park was different out here. No sounds of distant tourists or barking dogs. No signs marking every switchback on the trail. Just raw, untouched wilderness. I reveled in the isolation, feeling that rare freedom that city life could never provide. The first couple of miles were uneventful. A chipmunk scurried across the trail. A hawk circled lazily above. I stopped once to adjust my pack and sip some water, letting the sheer quiet of the valley seep into my bones. That's when I noticed something off to my right, just beyond the edge of the meadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The way the sun glinted off the granite can create strange illusions, turning shadows into shapes that aren't really there. But as I squinted, I realized this wasn't a shadow. It was a person. A man standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods. Something about him was wrong. His proportions seemed stretched, his arms hanging a little too long at his sides. He was facing me, or at least I thought he was. The details were hard to make out in the dappled sunlight, but it looked like his face was blank. Just smooth skin where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe he was wearing some kind of mask. Hiker, maybe? But who stands motionless like a statue? I called out to him, but got no response. No movement. Just that blank, faceless stare. My heart hammered as I took a step back, my fingers tightening around the straps of my pack. I blinked, and he was gone. Not walked away, gone. Just gone. Like he'd never been there at all. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he'd been. I've heard stories of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and while I didn't believe in anything like that, my mind flashed to various encounter stories I had heard. My rational brain kicked in, offering up excuses. You are tired. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. This is what happens when you spend too much time staring at shadows. I shook it off and kept moving. My steps felt heavier now, the valley around me a little darker, a little quieter. I told myself it was fine. Just a weird moment, nothing more. Still, when it came time to set up camp, I made sure to find a secluded spot far from where I'd seen him, just in case. By the time I pitched my tent, the sun was sinking low. I ate a quick dinner, a freeze-dried something or other that tasted like cardboard but filled the void in my stomach. Exhaustion crept in as the first stars appeared overhead, and I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The park at night is a different beast. The silence is so complete, it's almost loud. Every rustle of leaves and every distant crack of a branch feels amplified. I lay there, listening to the rhythm of my own breathing, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that I was alone. At some point, I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up feeling cold. The air inside the tent was icy, rushing against my face, which didn't make sense because I was in my tent. That's when I realized the door was open. Not just unzipped a little, completely open. The flap hung loosely and was swaying in the breeze. I shot up, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. My mind raced. I know I didn't forget to close it. I fumbled for my flashlight and shined it outside. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating only granite cliffs surrounding my camp. Nothing moved. No sign of anyone or anything. I sat there for what felt like hours, flashlight clutched in one hand, knife in the other. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a mistake. Maybe I'd been so tired I hadn't zipped it all the way. I zipped the tent back up, this time triple checking, and laid down again, though sleep didn't come easily. Outside, the park creaked and groaned, and every sound felt like a footstep. I didn't know it then, but the worst was still ahead. Much, much worse. I spent the next morning convincing myself it was nothing, a slip of my tired mind, but deep down the unease lingered as I packed up camp. A faceless, long-limbed man staring at me, and then my tent being opened in the middle of the night didn't feel like two coincidences. I forced myself back onto the trail, trying to focus on the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the granite dust. The sky was overcast now, the sun only peeking through in small bursts. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing back over my shoulder, expecting I don't know what, but the trail behind me was always empty. That's when I noticed a bundle of sticks bound tightly with rope, lying dead center on the trail. It wasn't large, maybe the size of my forearm, but it was intricately tied, with the sticks twisted and bent into a shape that vaguely resembled a human figure. I stared at it, my heart thudding in my chest. Someone had to have made this, and recently too. It hadn't been there the day before. I nudged it with my boot, afraid it might explode or something, some kind of prank. But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere pulling stunts like this, and why? I kicked the bundle into the underbrush and kept moving. The air felt colder now. The once soothing silence of the valley was starting to feel oppressive. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves had me scanning the cliffs, searching for movement. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. By late afternoon, the unease had grown unbearable. I decided to camp in an even more secluded spot that night, far from the trail. I found a small clearing nestled among the boulders and set my tent up quickly, my hands trembling slightly as I drove the stakes into the ground. The sun was sinking fast, and I didn't want to be caught fumbling in the dark. As night fell, I lit a small fire, hoping its warmth would settle my nerves. It didn't. Every crackle of the flame seemed to echo too loudly, and the shadows they cast seemed to drift in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to focus on my meal, but my appetite had vanished. Then I saw movement, just at the edge of the firelight. A shadow slipping between the boulders. My breath caught, and I froze, my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen it. I grabbed my flashlight, swept it across the boulders. It caught nothing but rocks and leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was out there watching. I doused the fire and retreated into my tent. As I was zipping it up, I saw two faint, glowing points of light high on the face of a cliff directly ahead of me. Eyes. They didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared down at me, unflinching. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, but at this point, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Those were eyes. The eyes didn't waver. I zipped up the tent, feeling trapped, like an animal caught in a snare, unable to run, unable to fight. I didn't sleep, and I didn't move until the sun was fully up. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, I stopped cold. A mark made of sticks and rope was lying just in front of the tent flap. It wasn't like the figure I'd seen before. This was deliberate and precise. I stared at it, my mind racing. Someone or something had been here while I was inside. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands trembling, and I hit the trail again, my eyes darting to every shadow, every boulder. I decided this trip was over. Whatever I'd come here to escape was nothing compared to what was haunting me. My pack bounced against my back as I trudged toward the trailhead, every muscle in my body aching from the tension I'd carried all night. I couldn't stop thinking about the mark outside my tent, the faceless man with long limbs, the twig doll, and the eyes. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the fabric, close enough to hurt me if they wanted to. The trail was empty as it had been since I started this trip. No hikers, no animals, just me and the endless valley. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, like an itch just beneath the skin, an unease I couldn't shake. After hours of hiking, I heard the faint crunch of granite beneath someone's feet behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trail. There was nothing there, just boulders and underbrush, the path winding back into the distance. I waited, straining to hear, to catch a glimpse of movement. Nothing but silence. I shook my head and started walking again, forcing myself to focus on the granite path ahead. My car wasn't far. I could make it. I just had to keep moving. Then a rock, barely larger than a pebble, landed on the path a few feet behind me with a soft, thick. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat again. Nothing. Another rock landed closer this time, then another. It wasn't random, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It was like something was hurting me, forcing me to keep moving. The path opened slightly, giving me a sliver of hope as I caught sight of the parking lot in the distance. My car was there, a beacon of safety in the oppressive valley. Relief surged through me, and I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the granite dust. I didn't care about the weight of my pack or the pain in my legs. I just had to get out. I slowed down as I approached my car. Through the driver's window, something was lying on the seat. Slowly, I approached the car, my hands shaking badly. Pressed against the window was one of my shirts, ripped and shredded, with dark stains along the fabric, and next to it, perfectly centered on the seat, was another mark made of sticks and rope. I reached for the door handle, and it was locked. Whatever had left that thing in my car had the keys. At some point, they'd been close enough to take them, close enough to lock the door again, close enough to have been inside my tent too. My fingers fumbled for the keys in my pocket, and thankfully, they were somehow there. I unlocked the door, threw my pack into the seat, climbed in, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest was heaving, and I felt like I was going to hyperventilate. I started the car and threw it into reverse, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror as I backed out of the lot. I was so focused on getting out of there that I almost didn't see him. Standing at the edge of the lot, just where the woods began, was the faceless man. He didn't move, didn't step forward or retreat. He just stood there, his long arms hanging at his sides, his featureless face tilted ever so slightly, as if he were watching me. I couldn't look away. Even as the car lurched onto the road, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. The man didn't chase me. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, unmoving. As I sped away down the winding road, my heart didn't slow until I reached the outskirts of the nearest town. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, waiting for me. I don't know what he was, what he wanted, or why he let me go. All I know is that I'll never go back to those woods. I don't think I could survive another encounter. It was mid-2021, and the world was shut down because of COVID. Everyone was cooped up in their homes, but I saw it as an opportunity to explore nature and get away from the chaos. Being a passionate solo adventurer, I decided to head to the forest of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia for a much-needed camping trip. Life had been a mess. One of the hobbies I picked up during the pandemic was counting cards. And let's just say I made a mistake that caused major financial loss for my team. The fallout was harsh. My reputation took a hit, and I had to switch apartments, changing my phone number, and eventually quitting my job. For a while, I dealt with anonymous harassing messages, some even threatening, but after a few months, the messages stopped, and I thought that people had finally moved on. Looking for peace, I packed my truck and drove the 3 hours to a secluded trailhead in Shenandoah. It was late winter, and the woods were blanketed in a thin layer of snow that crunched beneath my boots as I hiked. The trail was eerily quiet, likely because people were hunkering down at home due to the pandemic. After an hour, I reached a hidden stream that hadn't frozen over. The sound of rushing water was calming, and I found a small clearing to set up camp. By the time I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, sat by the fire, and began reading a book I'd brought along. Night fell quickly, and the flickering fire and my headlamp were the only source of light in the silent forest. I was alone, and it felt like I had the entire park to myself. Before leaving for this trip, I'd packed a few essentials for personal safety, including my old Smith & Wesson 442. I'd owned it for years, but rarely carried it outside of range practice. Shenandoah had always felt safe during my visits, but I had read online that with people visiting the parks less often, the bears had started to expand their territory. I didn't plan on shooting a bear, but the loud noise would scare them away. After finishing a few chapters of my book, I decided to stargaze a bit. I enjoyed some fresh herbs and leaned back against my pack, staring up at the visible stars through the tree branches. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I frowned. Who would be texting me? When I pulled out my phone, my stomach dropped. There were 3 texts from an unknown number with a 540 area code. They read, "How's the camping going?" "Nice spot you picked," and "I see you're enjoying the fire." These weren't casual messages. They were personal. Someone knew where I was. Feeling a wave of paranoia, I replied, "Who is this?" Minutes passed without a response. I stood up, shining my headlamp around the campsite, and scanned the surrounding woods. The beam of light illuminated nothing but trees and snow. Telling myself it was just a prank, I grabbed my 442 from my pack and slid it into my jacket pocket, comforted by the weight. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside. I tried to distract myself by watching videos on my phone, but the anxiety wouldn't let me relax. Then, another message came through. "Doesn't matter who I am." I felt my pulse quicken. I texted them back, asking how they knew I was there, but again, no response came. Suddenly, the silence of the forest was broken by the sound of snow crunching. Footsteps. My body tensed as I realized they were getting closer. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I strained my ears, listening for a moment, but whoever it was remained still. My phone buzzed again. The new text was a photo. My heart raced when I opened it. It was a picture of my tent from just a few feet away. Another message followed. "Good night." I snapped. Fueled by adrenaline and fear, I unzipped the tent and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound was deafening, echoing through the woods. I yelled, "I have a gun. Leave now." For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard retreating footsteps. Fast and deliberate, crunching through the snow. I stood there, shaking, the 442 still in my hands, until the sound faded completely. The fire outside had burned low, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow-covered clearing. I checked my phone again, scrolling through the messages and photos, trying to make sense of it. The number wasn't familiar, but the 540 area code was local. Whoever this person was, they weren't far from here. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees or rustle of the wind set me on edge. My grip on my gun tightened. I kept imagining scenarios like, what if they came back? What if they weren't alone? My mind raced, but one thing stood out. Whoever they were, they knew this park. They must have followed me in, maybe from the trailhead, and picked the perfect time to approach when I was most vulnerable. At first light, I broke camp, packing up as quickly as I could. I stayed hyper alert, scanning the trail for any signs of movement. At one point, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow, different from mine, leading away from the direction of my camp. They veered off the main trail into the deeper woods, disappearing into the underbrush. I made it back to my truck without incident, but as I loaded my gear into the bed, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper, a small folded piece of paper. My heart sank as I opened it. The note read, "Next time, don't bring a gun." The handwriting was neat, as if they had all the time in the world to write it. I drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. On the way out, I flagged down a park ranger and told them what happened. They recommended that I call the police, and after an officer arrived, I gave my statement and shared the text messages and phone number with the officer. Nothing else has happened since then, and I haven't heard back from the police. My life is much more settled now, but I often think back to how lucky I was that night that whoever it was wasn't more violent. When the weather permits, my dog Roxy and I take a hike on one of the various trails that inhabit the Black Bear Mountain Park. The peak of the mountain offers phenomenal views of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the valley below. With autumn in full swing, the vibrant oranges, yellows, and reds leave a breathtaking view. Roxy has become quite the hiker at this point in her young life. She keeps ahead of me, her backpack strapped on her with her own gear. Roxy and I usually spend the weekend camping out on Black Bear Mountain if we have the opportunity. Getting away from people, especially during the quarantine, has given me a great excuse to spend my free time camping. Certain areas of the large park can get quite crowded, especially ones that are closer to the various lakes. As the colder weather sweeps in, most of the casual campers have closed it in for the season. This happens to be my favorite time to camp. Not too hot, and the nights are just cold enough to keep bundled up in the tent. Roxy and I have spent many nights huddled together, cooking food over an open flame, and watching the sea of stars above us. It really is quite peaceful out here. That is, until the hikers find you. I remember the first group I saw. Roxy and I headed off trail about a mile or so to a more secluded spot near a stream. A flat, open area that was perfect to set up our tent. Roxy played by the water, nipping at the tiny rapids while I set up camp. We were planning on staying until Sunday, then hiking out. I packed freeze-dried meals, jerky, and some candy bars, and was prepping dinner before the sun settled. When night came, the quietness set in. Not a soul to be seen off the beaten path, isolated. just the way we liked it. I had a pistol just in case a black bear or a mountain lion decided to investigate our remote camp. There were many nights when Roxy would let out a growl from within the tent, warning me of sounds outside. Dusk came without incident. I boiled water from the stream and prepared Roxy and I some dinner. It was the right time of night where the sky was just dark enough and the stars started to reveal themselves. I marveled as they twinkled above us while petting Roxy. After we finished our meals, we zipped ourselves in the tent for the night. Sleep came easy. I often slept better out in the woods than when I was home in my own bed. As did Roxy, it seems. It must have been about 3 a.m. or so when I first heard it. A large rustling out in the woods that woke me up. I listened closely as Roxy was growling. The rustling drew closer, sounding more like footsteps. I wondered if it was someone out there. I thought maybe a park ranger was going to tell me I'm not allowed to camp this far out. I popped my head out from the tent and tried to follow the sounds. The rustling came from the side where we originally hiked in from. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, and I could see their outlines in the moonlight. They introduced themselves quietly and apologized and said they had gotten lost off the trail and were just looking for a place to stay for the night. Threw on my coat and headed out to meet the strangers. I zipped Roxy up in the tent because for some reason her haunches were up and she didn't seem to like these new people at our camp. The 3 of them had sat down around the fire pit. I struggled to light it in the cold, but managed to finally get a spark. My intention was to figure out who these people were, but the strangers didn't say a word. They just sat there mesmerized by the fire. A chill was creeping up my spine. Unsure if it was the temperature or the creepy people that emerged from the woods to find my remote camp. Couldn't put my finger on how they found me all the way out here. I was like a needle in a haystack with the spot that I picked. And I wondered why they didn't have any gear with them. It looked like they just rolled out of bed and decided to walk 7 miles into the woods in the dark. We sat there, the 4 of us, for about 20 minutes, all in silence. The fire crackled before us. They seemed to be put in a trance by it. When the awkwardness of the whole situation came to a boiling point, I finally stood up and asked them to leave. I wasn't interested in having 3 unknowns around while I slept, especially since they weren't giving me any details as to why they were here in the middle of the woods without gear. The 3 of them rose in unison, and I poured the rest of my water bottle on the fire, extinguishing it. The pressure seemed to rise as the 4 of us just stood there in the darkness. I nervously clutched my utility knife, praying I wouldn't have to use it. And then the figures turned, like soldiers, towards the woods and headed in a seemingly random direction. I watched their dark shapes disappear into the woods. I didn't get much sleep that night. When morning finally came, I packed up camp, and Roxy and I headed home. When we got back to town, I spoke with some people, and they told me some legends about strangers in the woods. I was apparently not the only person to meet a mysterious group of hikers in the woods. I did find I was one of the ones to survive. After doing some research, I learned about brutalized campsites. Campers were torn to bits and their belongings ravaged. Some locals chopped it up to hungry animals deep in the woods, but autopsy reports showed something different. Marks from strangulation, slices from glass, and knives along their bodies. The worst is human bite marks on the corpses. Something is out there in those woods. Word of mouth is if you see any of these mysterious hikers, you should just hunker down in your camp and wait for them to leave. My mind flashes back to the night I first encountered the group. I felt like I was on borrowed time after I spoke with them. Hiking, after all the research I did, lost its glamour. I'm too afraid now to run into some insane people living in the woods killing hikers. I've taken my hiking to other areas, and Roxy and I will do day trips, but nothing overnight. Maybe one of these days I'll spend the night in the woods again, but I fear my dear friends may come to pay a visit.